Judge Thompson prided himself on order, a control he believed absolute within his courtroom walls. But he hadn't anticipated Miss Evans, a lawyer whose quiet demeanor masked a steely resolve. The Tampa, Florida courthouse, accustomed to the ebb and flow of justice, was about to witness an unexpected clash. Sarah Evans, poised and professional, entered the courtroom, her simple black suit a stark contrast to the ornate woodwork. In her hand, she carried a slim legal pad, her expression focused. She was here for a routine hearing, a matter of contract law, something she could handle with ease. As she approached the defendant's table, Judge Richard Thompson's gaze fell upon her, lingering not on her face but on a small silver star of David necklace she wore. Judge Thompson, a man known for his rigid adherence to rules, cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Ms. Evans," he began, his tone sharp, "I must remind you that personal adornments have no place in my courtroom." Sarah's eyes met his, unwavering. 00106. "Your Honor, you are wearing a religious symbol that violates the neutrality of the space. You will need to remove it or face a fine." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff shifted, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The clerk glanced at the judge, then at Sarah. This wasn't the first time Judge Thompson had exerted his authority in unconventional ways, but it was the first time he'd targeted a lawyer over a necklace. Sarah didn't move. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but this is a piece of personal significance." "That is not how I see it," Judge Thompson replied, a hint of impatience in his voice. "Either remove it, or I will have to issue a fine for disregarding courtroom neutrality." For the first time in her career, Sarah Evans was threatened with a fine, not for legal missteps, but for wearing a symbol of her faith. The fine itself wasn't the issue, it was the principle. She didn't remove the necklace. Instead, she placed her legal pad on the table, her expression calm. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to address this matter formally." Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Address it?" "Yes, I'll be filing an objection and would like to state my argument on record." The judge smirked, glancing at the clock. "Ms. Evans, this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances." Sarah's gaze remained steady. "I'm also aware that constitutional rights don't take a recess for personal opinions." That got his attention. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The room was tense, not because of a contract dispute, but because a seasoned attorney had just challenged a judge's authority to his face. Sarah knew she was treading a dangerous path, but she wouldn't back down. "You're fining me for wearing a Star of David. Let's examine the legality of that, shall we?" The judge exhaled, rubbing his temples. But before he could respond, Sarah was already reaching into her briefcase. She wasn't just going to argue. She was about to dismantle his entire premise. Judge Thompson didn't realize the depth of the hole he had begun to dig. Sarah pulled out a single sheet of paper from her briefcase, placing it carefully on the table. She didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate. Every second of silence heightened the tension. Judge Thompson sighed. "Ms. Evans, I don't have time for theatrics." Sarah didn't blink. "Neither do I, Your Honor, but what I do have is a firm grasp of constitutional law." The judge leaned forward, his fingers laced together, bracing for what was to come. "You're fining me for wearing a Star of David, claiming it violates courtroom neutrality. But tell me, Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing that on?" The room was silent. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. The bailiff barely shifted. Judge Thompson let out a slow breath. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Ms. Evans." Sarah nodded. "It does, but that authority is not above the Constitution." She tapped the paper in front of her. "Under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it doesn't disrupt proceedings." The judge scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Sarah smiled, a hint of steel in her eyes. "Then let's talk case law, shall we?" She picked up the paper. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. A landmark case that established that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that's a school or a courtroom. Judge Thompson's jaw tightened slightly. He knew that case. Everyone in the legal field did. Sarah didn't stop. West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights. She set the paper down. Now, Your Honor, would you like me to continue or would you prefer to reconsider that fine? The judge's fingers tapped against the armrest. He was cornered and he knew it. But his pride wouldn't let him concede, not yet. This is not a religious debate, Ms. Evans. Sarah tilted her head. Then why did you make it one? A few quiet gasps broke out in the courtroom. Judge Thompson's face darkened. His voice was sharp, but his authority was waning. Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine, because so far, I haven't heard one. A long pause. The judge finally looked at the clerk. Mark the fine as pending review, Sarah smirked. I'll take that as a temporary victory. But she wasn't done yet. The real fight was just beginning. Judge Thompson's face remained unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way he shifted in his chair. He had expected quiet compliance, not a full-blown constitutional challenge. The air in the courtroom was electric. Sarah could feel it. Every eye was on her, watching, waiting. She had drawn a line in the sand, and now the judge had two choices: stand by his weak justification and risk humiliation, or find a way to backtrack without losing control. But Thompson wasn't one to back down easily. Ms. Evans, he began, his tone measured, courtroom rules exist for a reason. If I allow one form of personal expression, I open the door to all of them. Sarah's lips pressed together. You mean like the wedding bands worn by half the attorneys here? Or the lapel pins you allow on government officials? Thompson's jaw tightened. Sarah didn't let up. Or let's talk about the time you allowed a defense attorney to wear a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial. You had no issue with that. A few quiet murmurs broke out among the observers. Thompson shot a glare towards them, but the damage was done. Sarah had exposed his selective enforcement. Sarah sat back, crossing her arms. So tell me, Your Honor, why does this rule apply only to my Star of David? Thompson's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. He was trapped, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. He had enforced an unwritten rule, based on personal bias, and now it was crumbling beneath him. For the first time since the hearing began, he had no response. Sarah didn't need to gloat. She let the silence stretch, long enough for everyone to absorb the reality of the situation. Then she delivered the final blow. If you stand by this fine, Your Honor, I will be filing an appeal before the ink dries on the ruling. And when that happens, I guarantee this case will make headlines. She let that sink in. A sitting judge fining a woman for wearing a Star of David in court. I'm sure the higher courts would love to weigh in on that precedent. Thompson's nostrils flared. His ego and pride were fighting a war against cold, hard reality. Sarah didn't look away. She let him sit with it. The longer he delayed, the more obvious his mistake became. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply. The fine is rescinded, he muttered. Sarah smiled. Much appreciated, Your Honor. But this wasn't just about a fine anymore. She had just sent a message, loud and clear. One that Thompson wouldn't forget anytime soon. But the fallout was only just beginning. The judge's words, "The fine is rescinded," should have ended it. But the courtroom was no longer just a legal battleground. It was a spectacle, and everyone present had just witnessed something they weren't likely to forget. The court reporter barely looked up from her keyboard, but even she knew this transcript would circulate beyond this room. The clerk, who had initially looked uneasy when the fine was announced, now stole a quick glance at Sarah, almost as if impressed. Judge Thompson shifted in his chair, straightening his papers as if he could physically erase the moment. But Sarah knew better. This wasn't something he could brush aside. The silence was deafening. Sarah calmly adjusted her suit, the small silver Star of David still in place, exactly where it had been the entire time. She had won, but now she needed to make sure this wasn't just a personal victory. It had to mean something more. She turned to her client, a middle-aged business owner who had been the actual reason for this hearing. The man gave her a barely concealed nod of respect, his confidence in her only growing stronger. Sarah knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Outside the courthouse, The reaction was immediate. A reporter, one who had been covering an entirely different case in the same building, caught wind of what had just unfolded. Within an hour, a local news website had posted the headline, "Florida Judge Attempts to Fine Attorney for Wearing Star of David, but it doesn't go as planned." Sarah's phone buzzed, then again and again. Colleagues, former law school classmates, journalists. People wanted to know what had just happened. But Sarah wasn't interested in headlines or media spins. She had a bigger picture in mind. Her next step, taking this case beyond just one courtroom skirmish. She wasn't naive. She knew that cases like these had ripple effects, whether she intended them to or not. This wasn't just about a single judge and a single attorney anymore. This was a challenge to a precedent that hadn't yet been set, but very well could be. Would other judges attempt something similar? Would attorneys feel pressured to leave their personal symbols at home to avoid confrontation? Would this moment embolden others to push the boundaries of courtroom neutrality in ways that targeted personal beliefs? Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. By that evening, the story had already taken on a life of its own. A well-known legal commentator on a conservative news station brought it up during a panel discussion. On social media, heated debates broke out between those who supported the judge's stance and those who saw Sarah's defiance as an important stand for constitutional rights. Sarah sat in her office, watching the discussion unfold on her phone. A producer from a national news network had already reached out, requesting an interview. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. She had spent years fighting for clients, standing her ground in high-stakes cases. But this felt different. This wasn't about corporate disputes or criminal defenses. This was about personal freedoms and whether they could be stripped away on the whim of a single judge. But Judge Thompson wasn't done with her yet. She could sense it. Even as she left the courthouse that day, the way he had looked at her before banging the gavel and dismissing the session. He might have rescinded the fine, but there had been something in his expression, an unspoken challenge. Sarah wasn't sure what form it would take, but she knew this battle was far from over. Sarah had expected some fallout, a few emails, maybe a couple of phone calls from colleagues weighing in. What she hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which everything escalated. By the time she walked into her office the next morning, her assistant David was already waiting with a concerned expression. "You need to see this," he said, holding up his tablet. Sarah took it, scanning the screen. The Florida Bar Association had just issued a statement, carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the rules set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Sarah let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment. This was a warning. The words "respect the rules set forth by presiding judges" weren't just a general statement. It was a signal. The legal world was tight-knit. The Florida bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was getting out of hand. This meant Thompson wasn't just bitter. He was already working behind the scenes to rally institutional backing. She set the tablet down. "This came out today?" David nodded. "An hour ago." Sarah wasn't surprised. The legal community was small. Word had traveled fast, and Thompson clearly wasn't taking this lightly. But before she could say another word, David hesitated. "There's more," he said carefully. Sarah glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Go on." David handed her another document, this one printed. Sarah skimmed the first few lines, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. Attorney Sarah Evans conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Sarah couldn't help it. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming," she shook her head. "That's rich." David sighed. "It's retaliation, pure and simple." Sarah leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Thompson wasn't just looking for payback. He was trying to set an example. He had lost in his own courtroom, and now he was using the system to reassert his power. By filing this formal complaint, he was trying to flip the narrative. He was no longer the judge who overstepped his authority. He was painting himself as the one who had been disrespected, And Sarah, he wanted to make her look like the reckless attorney who had challenged him just for the sake of challenging him. Sarah had seen this move before. It was a common tactic. Turn the accuser into the accused. Reframe the story so the real issue got buried beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. But she wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" she asked, already shifting gears. David exhaled. "You'll have to respond within 10 days. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Sarah nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" David hesitated. "A panel that includes judges and senior attorneys." Sarah almost smiled. If Thompson was hoping to bury her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated. Because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was about to become very public. David studied her, waiting for her reaction. "What do you want to do?" Sarah took a deep breath, then reached for her phone. "If Thompson wants to play games, let's play." She scrolled through her contacts, her mind already 10 steps ahead. Thompson thought she was going to defend herself in a closed-door hearing, accept a quiet reprimand, and move on. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. Sarah had spent her career playing the long game, and now she was about to make sure everyone was watching. Sarah didn't waste time. She knew how these things worked. Retaliation was most effective when it happened in the shadows. Thompson wanted to handle this quietly, using the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen. She scrolled through her phone, found the contact she needed, and pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Sarah? I was just about to call you." It was Elena Vance, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program. She had covered some of Sarah's biggest cases before, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. Sarah got straight to the point. "Elena, I need you to listen carefully. A judge just filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings. But what really happened? He tried to fine me for wearing a Star of David, and when I stood my ground, he backed down. But now he's using the system to punish me instead." Elena was silent for a moment, then she let out a sharp breath. "You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power?" Sarah smiled. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Elena didn't hesitate. "I'm running this." Sarah leaned forward. "I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Thompson won't be able to twist this into a quiet disciplinary issue." Elena was already on it. "I'll have a segment up by tomorrow and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in, especially ones who won't be afraid to call this out for what it is." Sarah hung up, feeling the first stirrings of momentum shifting in her favor. But she wasn't done yet. She turned back to David. "Draft a public statement. I want to make my position clear before Thompson and his allies try to muddy the waters." David nodded. "You want to frame this as judicial overreach?" Sarah shook her head. "I want to frame it as exactly what it is, an attack on personal rights and an abuse of judicial power. If this judge thinks he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a platform." David's expression hardened. "I'll get it done." Sarah exhaled, gathering her thoughts. Thompson had been counting on silence. But now the country was about to find out exactly what he had done. Sarah didn't have to wait long. By the time she sat down with her coffee the next morning, her phone was already buzzing nonstop. News outlets had picked up Elena Vance's segment overnight, and social media was ablaze. The headline was everywhere. "Florida judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing Star of David. Now he's under fire." It wasn't just conservative outlets running the story. Legal analysts across the board, left, right, and center, were weighing in. A constitutional lawyer from Georgetown went on live television to tear Thompson's logic apart, calling it a blatant overreach that has no legal standing. Another high-profile attorney posted a thread dissecting how Sarah's actions had exposed a dangerous precedent that needed to be addressed. And then came the statement Sarah had been waiting for. The Florida Judicial Review Board announced that due to the media attention, they would be reviewing Judge Thompson's conduct to determine whether his ruling had violated judicial ethics. Sarah leaned back in her chair, exhaling. This was no longer just about her. This was about every attorney, every defendant, every person who had ever stepped into a courtroom, wondering whether their rights could be stripped away with a stroke of a judge's pen. David walked in, holding up his phone. You're going to want to see this. Sarah took it and pressed play. It was Thompson. He was standing outside the courthouse, cameras flashing around him. His expression was stiff. The statement was short, too short for someone trying to defend himself. I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom. The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully. Sarah almost laughed. Neutrality. He was still trying to play that card. David crossed his arms. He's trying to save face. Sarah nodded. And failing, because this wasn't going away. The Judicial Review Board had a decision to make. If they ruled against Thompson, it wouldn't just be a professional embarrassment, it would set a precedent, one that protected people like Sarah from ever facing this kind of retaliation again. But even if they didn't formally reprimand him, he had already lost where it mattered most: his reputation, his credibility, his authority. Because after this, every attorney who walked into his courtroom would know. This was the judge who tried to silence someone and lost. Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee, then looked up at David. We won. David smiled. Oh, I know. Sarah set her cup down. She hadn't just fought for herself. She had sent a message. Never let someone in power strip away your rights without a fight. Because sometimes all it takes is one person standing their ground to change everything. If you believe in standing up for your rights, make sure your voice is heard. Like, comment, and subscribe for more real stories that matter.